One morning in 1983 in Dresden, East Germany, a woman named Vera woke up and went to the bathroom to do her morning routine. Something was wrong. Her hairbrush was on the left side of the sink. She always left it on the right. There was a teacup on the counter that she didn't remember putting there. And the alarm clock had gone off 20 minutes earlier than she had set it. Vera looked around the apartment. Everything seemed to be in order, but the feeling that something had changed wouldn't go away. She didn't know it, but the previous night, while she slept, 2 agents from the Ministry for State Security had silently entered her apartment. They had a copy of the key. They had photographed her personal documents, read her mail, and rearranged some objects, almost imperceptibly, but deliberately, enough to make her uncomfortable without being able to identify why. That's what they wanted. Vera was not being prepared for prison. She was not being investigated for a crime. The objective was not to arrest her. The goal was to drive her insane. This was the Stasi, the Ministry for State Security of East Germany. And what they were doing to Vera had an official name within the organization. They called it Zersetzung. In Portuguese, decomposition. The idea was simple and disturbing. Instead of arresting dissidents and turning them into martyrs, the Stasi preferred to destroy them from within, to ruin their reputations, to isolate their families, to make them doubt their own sanity, until they had no more energy, no more courage, no more will to resist. And it worked, because the Stasi was no ordinary secret police force. It was something history had never seen before, and perhaps never will see again. Welcome to Files Undercover, the channel where we delve into the most dangerous operations, the most buried secrets, and the stories governments would rather you never know. Today's story is Inside the Stasi, the secret police that saw everything in East Germany. To understand the Stasi, you first need to understand the country that created it. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, was born in 1949 from the ashes of World War II. It was the part of Germany that had come under Soviet control after Hitler's defeat. And from day one, there was a problem that its leaders couldn't ignore. The people didn't want to be there. West Germany, across the border, was rebuilding under the Marshall Plan. Democracy, freedom of movement, an economy that was growing at a rate known as the German economic miracle. On the eastern side, there was rationing, communist bureaucracy, and a single-party system that tolerated no opposition. Between 1949 and 1961, before the construction of the Berlin Wall, approximately 3.5 million East Germans simply left. They crossed the border. They never returned. It was a population hemorrhage that threatened to disintegrate the country. The government had an existential problem. How does one maintain a regime when its own citizens abandon it en masse? The answer was the Stasi. Founded on February 8, 1950, the Ministry for State Security was born with a simple and totalitarian mission: to know everything about everyone. And this was not a vague aspiration. It was a concrete operational directive, repeated in internal documents with a regularity that revealed the organization's obsession. Here's the question that will guide everything you'll hear today. How did an organization with limited resources, in a small and poor country, manage to build the most extensive surveillance apparatus per capita the world has ever known, surpassing even Hitler's Gestapo and the Soviet KGB? The answer lies in the perverse genius of a single man. Erich Mielke was born in 1907 in a working-class neighborhood of Berlin. The son of a carpenter, he joined the Communist Party at the age of 18. In 1931, at the age of 23, he participated in the murder of 2 Berlin policemen during a political confrontation. To escape imprisonment, he fled to the Soviet Union. There, he was recruited by the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB, and spent decades learning the methods of the Soviet political police. When East Germany was created, Mielke returned as a distilled product of decades of Stalinist repression. In 1957, he took command of the Stasi, and for 32 years, he would govern this machine with an obsession bordering on the pathological. Mielke wanted to know everything, and that wasn't a metaphor. There was a department in the Stasi responsible for checking if citizens had illegal Western food in their trash. There were agents infiltrated in teenage computer clubs that traded Western video games. There were designated informants in every apartment building. There were hidden cameras with holes drilled in the walls of hotel rooms and private apartments. But what truly made the Stasi unique in history wasn't just its surveillance technology. It was its human scale. Behind every camera, every microphone, every intercepted letter, there were people. Many people. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, the Stasi employed 91,015 full-time staff. For a country with just over 16 million inhabitants, that would already be a staggering ratio. One agent for every 180 citizens. But the real number was much higher. The Stasi also maintained a network of unofficial collaborators. In German, inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, abbreviated as IM. These were ordinary citizens recruited to spy on their own neighbors, colleagues, friends, and even family members. Conservative estimates point to 173,000 active informants in 1989. Higher estimates reach 500,000. When you add up the staff and informants, the Stasi had approximately one agent for every 6.5 citizens of East Germany. For comparison, Hitler's Gestapo, often cited as the ultimate example of 20th century police terror, maintained one agent for every 2,000 Germans. Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, who survived the Holocaust and spent decades hunting war criminals, said of the Stasi, "It was even more oppressive than the Gestapo." Think about that for a second. The organization that built extermination camps, that instilled terror throughout Europe. That was the ultimate symbol of 20th century totalitarianism. According to Wiesenthal, a man who knew both intimately, the Stasi was worse. But how did the Stasi recruit all these informants? The answer is complex and disturbing because it rarely involved direct coercion at the outset. Some informants were genuinely convinced that they were serving the socialist homeland. They were ideologically committed to the regime, believed in the cause, and saw the act of reporting suspicious neighbors as a patriotic duty. Others were recruited for convenience. A student who wanted a place at university, an employee who desired a promotion, a traveler who needed permission to visit relatives in the West. The Stasi offered what the communist bureaucracy made scarce: access, opportunity, privilege. And others were simply coerced. The Stasi would discover something incriminating: a forbidden love affair, a relative who had fled to the West, an inconvenient private conversation, and use that information as leverage. You help us, and we forget what we know about you. The result was a society in which the concept of trust had been systematically destroyed. No one knew for sure who was an informant, because the answer was, potentially, anyone. The archives opened after the fall of the wall revealed stories that are still difficult to process today. A woman discovered that her husband of 15 years had been a Stasi informant throughout their marriage, reporting on their conversations, their movements, their political opinions. A man who had spent years trying to understand why his career had mysteriously stalled discovered that his childhood best friend had been sending him reports on him since adolescence. A mother discovered that her adult daughter, to whom she had confided her deepest fears, had reported them word for word to a Stasi agent. These were not exceptional cases. They were the norm. It is estimated that more than 6 million East Germans had a Stasi file on them, more than a third of the country's total population. Each file was a disturbingly complete portrait of a life: friends, habits, fears, aspirations, character flaws, love affairs. And these files weren't just gathering dust on shelves. They were being used. The Stasi had two main operational models that evolved throughout its existence. The first method, in the 1950s and 1960s, was simple and brutal: suspicion, arrest, interrogation, confession, sentence. Stasi prisons, especially Hohenschönhausen in East Berlin, were places where physical terror was methodically employed. Hohenschönhausen did not exist on maps. The area where it was located was shown as a blank space on all official city maps. Prisoners were transported there in windowless vehicles, with deliberately confusing routes so they could not determine where they were being taken. After their release, many prisoners discovered that they had been only a few kilometers from their own homes during their entire detention. Inside Hohenschönhausen, one of the preferred interrogation techniques was sleep deprivation. Prisoners were kept in tiny cells, too small to lie down in, just large enough to stand up in. Every time they fell asleep, a guard would wake them. This went on for days. For weeks, testimonies from over 900 former detainees document what happened there. But while the Stasi was active, none of them could prove where they were. No outside court had jurisdiction, and the Western world barely knew the place existed. But the Stasi was adaptable. In the 1970s, East Germany was trying to gain international recognition. Détente agreements with West Germany, diplomatic visibility, participation in the Olympics. All of this made visible physical terror increasingly inconvenient. If a dissident were arrested and tortured, there was a risk that the story would reach the West and create a scandal. This would damage the image the regime was trying to build. Then, the Stasi invented something smarter, more cruel, and completely undetectable. They called it Zersetzung, decomposition. The central idea was brilliant in its perversity. Instead of making a dissident a martyr, you destroy him silently. You cause him to destroy himself. You create the conditions for his life to crumble, while the state keeps its hands seemingly clean. Zersetzung operatives were meticulously planned based on detailed psychological dossiers of each target. The Stasi created what they called a psychogram, a complete profile of an individual's personality, their specific fears, insecurities, points of pride, the people they depended on emotionally, and the most vulnerable aspects of their professional and personal life. Then, the work began. In the first phase, the secret surveillance was supplemented by signs that the target could perceive but couldn't prove. Strange phone calls that would disconnect when answered, unexplained noises on the line, men who seemed to be standing on the street below with suspicious frequency, co-workers who suddenly became cold for no apparent reason. The goal was to create the feeling of being watched, without providing concrete proof. In the second phase, physical interventions began. Agents broke into apartments when residents were away and made almost imperceptible alterations. Alarm clocks were set to ring earlier. Pictures were removed and put back slightly crooked. Food was switched. Furniture was moved millimeters, enough to make something seem wrong, but not enough so that the target wasn't sure what had changed. Vehicles were sabotaged in ways that appeared to be normal mechanical failures. Mail was intercepted, opened, copied, and resealed, sometimes with minor modifications that caused confusion or conflict. And then came the most devastating phase: social destruction. Rumors were carefully spread among colleagues and acquaintances. Compromising information, some true, some fabricated, all mixed together to maximize the damage, was leaked to employers, romantic partners, and family members. Someone with a history of infidelity would see that story reach their spouse through channels that couldn't be traced back to the Stasi. Someone who had made an inconvenient political statement in private would find that statement whispered in their workplace. The target lost jobs, lost relationships, lost friendships, lost reputation, and, often, lost their sanity. The result of successful Zersetzung campaigns was often what modern psychiatrists would recognize as nervous breakdown, severe depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder. But there was an even darker element. Because the Stasi did all this in such a way that the victim couldn't prove, and often couldn't even believe, that they were being persecuted by the state. When someone tried to tell what was happening, it sounded like paranoia. It sounded like someone mentally unstable was inventing a conspiracy. It was gaslighting elevated to the level of state policy. When Jürgen Fuchs, a writer and poet who had been targeted by Zersetzung, finally managed to publish articles about the Stasi's tactics in a Western magazine, the Stasi itself launched a campaign claiming that he suffered from a persecution complex, that he was unbalanced, that his allegations were the product of a disturbed mind. Decades later, when the Stasi files were opened, it was proven that every detail Fuchs had described was meticulously documented in the organization's internal reports. The state had created evidence in its own files that it was doing exactly what the victim claimed, while simultaneously destroying the victim's credibility so that no one would believe her. But the Stasi was not confined to the borders of East Germany. Under the leadership of Markus Wolf, the Stasi's head of foreign intelligence from 1952 to 1986, nicknamed the Man Without a Face by the West, because for decades Western intelligence services had no photograph of him. The Stasi penetrated deep into the government, armed forces, and intelligence services of West Germany. Markus Wolf was a spy of rare genius, His specialty was what he called Romeos, highly trained male agents who seduced secretaries and assistants of Western government figures to gain access to classified information. The most devastating case was that of Günther Guillaume. Guillaume was a personal advisor to the Chancellor of West Germany, Willy Brandt, one of the most important leaders of democratic Europe and the architect of the policy of détente with the East. For years, Guillaume had access to Brandt's inner circle, participated in state decisions, and transmitted classified information directly to East Berlin. When Guillaume was finally discovered to be a Stasi agent in April 1974, the scandal was so devastating that Brandt resigned as chancellor 2 weeks later. The Stasi had overthrown a democratically elected leader of one of Western Europe's largest democracies. No confrontation, just information, patience, and a well-placed agent. Within East Germany, the scale of surveillance had an effect that went beyond individual cases of persecution. She developed what researchers call generalized self-control. When people believe they can be observed at any moment, they begin to censor themselves, even in the absence of any real surveillance. They stop making political comments in public. They avoid associations with people considered suspicious. They adjust their behavior, their words, even their visible thoughts, to match what they believe is acceptable to whoever might be watching. The Stasi didn't need to monitor everyone all the time. They just needed people to believe they could be watched all the time. It was the difference between a prison with bars and a prison without walls, where the citizens themselves built the bars within themselves. In November 1989, East Germany collapsed. The Berlin Wall fell on the night of November 9th. In the following weeks, the regime disintegrated with a speed that surprised even the most optimistic analysts in the West. But inside the Stasi headquarters on Normannen Street in East Berlin, the officers weren't celebrating. They were panicking. On Mielke's orders, agents began destroying the files. Shredders worked day and night. When the shredders stopped working from overwork, and there was a shortage of shredders in impoverished East Germany, agents were secretly sent to West Berlin to buy new equipment. In at least one building in the complex, more than 100 burned shredders were found. Where the machines were insufficient, documents were torn up by hand and piled into bags. In the end, the Stasi had filled 16,000 bags with destroyed or partially destroyed documents. But it wasn't enough. On January 15, 1990, thousands of East German citizens stormed the Stasi headquarters. Not violently, but with determination. They wanted to save what remained of the archives. They wanted to prevent decades of evidence about what had been done to them from disappearing forever. It was one of the most extraordinary scenes of the fall of European communism. The same citizens whom the Stasi had watched, persecuted, and tried to silence for 40 years, taking back the documents that the organization had compiled about their own lives. What remained of the archives was incomprehensible in scale. Even after all the destruction, what remained amounted to approximately 111 linear kilometers of documents. Archives that, laid out side by side, would occupy more than the distance from Berlin to Hamburg. More pages of text than all of German literature produced from the Middle Ages to the Second World War. And in these documents, Germans discovered truths that forever changed their understanding of their own lives. They discovered that parents had reported on children, that children had reported on parents, that spouses had turned in spouses, that friends of decades had been informants from the beginning. Many of these files were accessed by those who were in them. More than 2 million people requested access to their personal files in the following decades. For many, reading them was more traumatizing than anything the Stasi had done to them in life. Because it put a face, often a loved and familiar face, to the betrayal they had suffered. And what about Mielke? In November 1989, during a session of the East German Parliament broadcast live on television, Erich Mielke was summoned to justify his existence before representatives who, for the first time in decades, were no longer puppets of the party. The man who had directed the largest surveillance machine in modern history stood before the cameras. The parliamentarians booed him, and Mielke, clearly out of his element, looked at the camera and uttered a phrase that went down in history as one of the greatest moments of political absurdity of the 20th century. I love everyone, all people. I love everyone, all human beings. The man who had ordered the psychological destruction of tens of thousands of citizens, who had kept secret files on a third of his own country's population, who had sent agents to break into apartments while people slept and rearrange their belongings to disturb them. This man was telling the world that he loved all human beings. The room erupted in boos. Mielke was arrested in 1990, tried in 1993, but not for any of the crimes committed during his leadership of the Stasi. Most of them were never formally prosecuted. He was convicted of 2 murders committed in 1931 when he was 23 years old, before fleeing to the Soviet Union. He spent his final years in a Berlin prison, becoming the oldest inmate in the facility. Over time, he descended into dementia, spending hours of the day conversing with imaginary Stasi officers through a telephone his guards had given him to keep him calm. He died in 2000 at the age of 92, apparently never having regretted anything. The 16,000 torn bags of documents remain a problem without a complete solution. For decades, the German government employed a group of employees to try to manually reassemble the paper fragments, a task that would take hundreds of years if done by hand. In recent decades, artificial intelligence has been used to try to piece together the digitized fragments. Progress is real, but slow. And the question remains, what was in those documents that the Stasi considered too important to leave in existence? The Stasi exists today as a warning that the world has not yet fully learned to heed. She showed us that a population can be controlled without visible concentration camps, without mass violence, without a declared war against its own citizens, just with enough information, and with the awareness, or even just the suspicion, that someone is always watching. In 2013, when Edward Snowden revealed the extent of the American NSA's surveillance programs, the reaction in Germany was unlike any other country in the world. The Germans instinctively understood what it meant. They had already lived through it. In a survey conducted shortly after Snowden's revelations, Germans who had grown up in East Germany demonstrated significantly higher levels of digital self-censorship than their Western counterparts. Decades after the end of the Stasi, the reflex was still there. Someone might be watching, so it's best to be careful what you say. This is the most enduring and insidious legacy of an organization that no longer exists. She taught us that the most effective instrument for controlling a population is not brute force. It's fear, doubt, uncertainty about who to trust. And it taught us that when a state decides it needs to know everything about everyone, whether with shredders and open letters powered by Steam, or with algorithms and cell phone data, what is destroyed is not just privacy. It's about trust. It's about solidarity. It's about people's ability to come together to change what they disagree with. The Stasi collapsed in 1990, but the questions she leaves us with still stand. If this story stuck in your head, and I bet it did, leave a like here. It's simple, takes 2 seconds, and really helps to get these stories to more people. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Every week there's a new operation, a new secret, a new story that deserves to be told properly. The next one is coming, and it's even deeper.